Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 launch of the annual review of South African philanthropy. We are delighted to have you all here, and we're delighted to be able to host this panel discussion as part of the launch of the review. I'm going to hand over to Shelagh Gastrow, who is the editor of the annual review of South African philanthropy. I think in philanthropic circles, Shelagh needs very little introduction, as we all know her as the wonderfully wise and experienced advisor and consultant to the philanthropy, development and advancement space. So without further ado, thank you, Shelagh, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome everybody to this very exciting event, and I'm just going to put a picture up. Here's the review, if you've not seen it before. Before I say anything, I would like to introduce Colette from the Ball Family Foundation and recognize the contribution that the Ball Family Foundation has made in funding the production of this review. So I'm going to hand over to you, Colette.
Thank you, Shelagh. Everyone seeing me, everything fine? Yeah? Okay, so by way of introduction, my name is Colette Ball and I am here representing the Ball Family Foundation. I'm extremely proud that as a foundation, we are able to sponsor the second annual review of South African private philanthropy. And I'm both amazed and impressed by the work that Shelagh Gastrow, the other board members and the entire team have put together in making such an excellent piece of work. Thank you, Shelagh. I managed to look through it online and it looks absolutely brilliant. I first came across Shelagh when she had written an article in early 2019. And I was inspired to put into practice something that I felt had plagued me for a very long time. It was my strongly held belief that there was a lack of awareness regarding the role and impact of private philanthropy in South Africa, and that there needed to be a way of putting the spotlight on the work done by the entities in this field. I also felt that there had to be there was not enough networking taking place between the various bodies, and there needed to be some way of conveying the message of who was doing what in order that collective collaboration could take place and so that lessons learned could be shared. This in order to address the myriad needs that are experienced in South Africa each and every day. For these reasons, our foundation agreed to Shelagh's proposal that the Ball Family Foundation support an annual review of philanthropy in South Africa, which would strive to achieve three main goals, namely, to create awareness regarding the work done by the private philanthropy sector in South Africa. Secondly, to create a platform which would allow foundations and other funders to network and collaborate, share ideas and support one another. And thirdly, to encourage other families and members of the general public to become involved in this growing community. I'm happy to report that all of these goals and more have been achieved. Independent philanthropic data is now much more readily available than in previous years. And post the publication of the 2019 annual review, Shelagh and other members of her team were interviewed on numerous radio stations, and there were several newspaper articles, all of which helped to raise the awareness. Networking has become a much more accepted solution to identifying and creating new workable solutions where co-funding and cooperation can take place. This was most clearly seen in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where organizations from across South Africa collaborated in order to meet the needs of the various communities in the best and quickest way possible. And lastly, there has been an undeniable growth in the number of family foundations in South Africa, from just 9 in 2009 to what is believed to be a number of 36 in 2020. I think you would all have to agree that the review has been a great success. I do believe that the potential for the continued growth of private philanthropy in South Africa is exponential. And I thank you all for the role that you have played in this field and that you continue to play. I will now hand over to Shelagh Gastrow, who will be able to give you a much better and fuller account. Thank you, Shelagh.
Thanks very much, Colette. And once again, from everybody, your sponsorship of this review is really greatly appreciated. When thinking about this particular review, it has been really difficult because it was an extraordinary, or is still an extraordinary year. The content of the review was conceptualized in January and February 2020, and then of course the world changed. We had to ask ourselves if the review would then focus on philanthropy and COVID, which is the big story of the year, but we decided to keep as much of the original framework as possible, as this review is about perspectives and stories of philanthropy in South Africa, and we didn't want to lose those stories for a short-term focus. However, COVID did change the paradigm, and many of the articles include an element of adaptation as a result of COVID. The anchor article by Halima Mohammed, and we really were so delighted that she could write this, and she's just had a baby. It's entitled Philanthropy Reimagined, and it gives a lot of food for thought, especially as she points out potential new norms for philanthropic practice regardless of a crisis or not. What all South Africans could see in this crisis was the lack of a safety net at such times. And as Colette said, how ordinary people took up the cudgels of Ubuntu and took the responsibility to reach out and work with the most marginalized and vulnerable people. Examples of this appear in this edition with a wonderful photo essay by renowned photographer Paul Weinberg, who photographed ordinary people doing this kind of work. It appears with short commentary from each person. It is there that we can see the range of people who have come together in real community philanthropy. In addition, we have an article on how a network of Somali shopkeepers found the resources to distribute food in the poor communities that they serve. As Halima indicates, everyday people-based solidarity efforts have and continue to provide an unsurpassed philanthropic response, which should be acknowledged for its speed, responsiveness, flexibility, and reach. This is indeed a fundamental element of the national philanthropic narrative. Readers will also notice that this edition has a strong focus on education. This wasn't deliberate, but each author was asked to write about the activities from a different angle. However, all roads in the end led to education. And this edition is a fascinating exploration of philanthropy's role in education at all levels. It is indeed an anchor sector that impacts on all else. The stories include different strategies to strengthen education, from the building of libraries, after-school programs, provision of safe space for learners, development of technology for schools, and partnering schools to improve school management, performance management systems, and improved administration. More deliberate was the inclusion of reports on various studies undertaken in 2019 to 2020 on philanthropic data, both in South Africa and the rest of the continent. Most of you know that there's a dearth of the size of data on the size and scope of philanthropy, and so every research project has enormous value. It's always been elusive, and even the 4 studies that we have in the review provide us not with a great deal of clarity, but a better understanding. Of specific interest is the report on the annual survey of philanthropy in higher education, so that's one sector, which was published by Inyatelo, the South African Institute for Advancement, and authored by Sean Jones. This specific data has been tracked since 2013. And what is amazing is there's been a wonderful shift away from dependency on international funding to a massive growth in local support to universities. Funding to universities from South African sources grew from 46% of giving in 2014 to 72% in 2017. At the same time, international funding grew, but local philanthropy outstripped it substantially, with significant growth in corporate and individual giving in particular. Above all this, there is a call and a reminder that we don't have long to avoid environmental disaster that can undo all our efforts, with a specific call in this review for philanthropy to ensure climate change becomes a central focus in its work. Specifically, philanthropy should assist in changing the way we live and begin to prepare communities to adapt to a harsh environment for human life. In addition, there is a call for philanthropy to counter the vested interests that are propping up the existing system that has brought the world to this precipice. I hope the second review of South African philanthropy stimulates all our thinking about where we are now and where we are going. South African philanthropy has the potential to play an important role in change, not only through its funding, but also in its ability to leverage its funds, to seed new initiatives, and to convene and bring together various players to change our circumstances. You may all be wondering how to obtain a copy of the review. It is available on the IPASA website, www.ipa-sa.org.za. And if you would like a hard copy, please contact Lauren at IPASA, Lauren, Lauren, at ipa-sa.org.za. Finally, thank you to all the authors who produced these articles under difficult circumstances this year. And I'm sorry I had to chase you and follow up. You probably thought, oh, there's another email from Sheila again. To Michael Darries for the design of the publication, to the editorial board that provided extremely helpful guidance, and to the staff of IPASA for their assistance. Importantly, I'd like again to recognize the contribution of the Ball Family Foundation that has funded the production of this review. I'm now going to hand over to Paul Periera, because we now have a panel discussion with some of the authors of articles in this review. Paul, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Sheila, and welcome everybody. Just been muted. People have been wanting to do that for decades, I can tell you. Welcome everybody to our discussion. I want to just quickly, and not take too long on it, but I'd like to reiterate what both Sheila and Colette have said about the review and encourage everybody in the audience to go and get a copy off the website, off the IPASA website. I've gone through it deeglik, and it's a review that has an extraordinary range of different types of insight coming in from all sorts of quite different aspects of philanthropic work, but they're interesting insights. They're useful to everybody's work, and even if you're not in direct philanthropy, because even though philanthropy approaches its work in the developmental sector slightly differently to everybody else by dint of what it is, there is much for us to share, learn across the board. And, you know, collaboration, when it's a thing of lowest denominators, is a thing of losers. But when it's a thing of high insight, lessons learned, open sharing without being selfish, it's a thing of great impetus to success. And there's a lot of that in the review. So I commend it to everybody. And as Sheila said, our panelists today have all contributed very good pieces in the review. But, you know, we've got like half an hour, so we're not going to deal with presentations or summaries of what those are. I point you to the review. You will find them there. You won't be disappointed. What I thought we'd do today is go a little bit big picture and talk and use this time we have together. And it's quite a long time. Half an hour is quite a long time to just chat in short bits about our insights. And yes, it's been a COVID year, and yes, that does define 2020 and how. So we will deal a bit with that. Now, first, let me introduce the panelists, and I'll just give you names and where they're from. And there's Khayakazi Namfu, and she's with the Public Schools Partnership. We've got Bridget Fury from Oppenheimer Generations Philanthropy. We've got Sibongile Khumalo from the Learning Trust. And all the way from France, we welcome Bathylle Missika from the OECD, as you will know, and if you don't, it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I've also suggested to Shelagh Gastrow and invited her to contribute at any point in the conversation, given, as Sarah pointed out, her deep knowledge of the sector. So she's welcome. Shelagh, consider yourself an honorary panelist for the next half hour. Yes, everywhere, for obvious reasons, we ask each other, what did we learn in COVID-19? And I think that's too big a question, because very often, and always in fact, there are lots of things we've learned. So I'd like to kick us off by setting that scene. Each panelist, if they could just offer to me, and thus to the audience, to everybody here, a single insight that they think is the most useful one to share, or the most interesting to them in the work that they have done in what was an unforeseen situation of COVID-19. And I'm going to start with Bridget Fury, and we'll run through the entire panel.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me on the panel. I think so much that's been discussed today has been around collaboration, and I think the big takeout I have is kind of connected to that, but it's around the ability to put competition aside in a crisis and to work together with this extraordinary collective energy when you have a goal that you want to achieve. And that's certainly the thing that I think my experience in working with the setting up of the South Africa Future Trust, which was set up as a direct consequence of the lockdown in South Africa, and Oppenheimer Generations Foundation's desire to very quickly deploy money to people who would need it. And we worked alongside government, and we worked alongside SARS, and we worked alongside the banks, people who typically don't work together, who are in fierce competition, and everyone without fail put aside their competitive instincts and their kind of siloed thinking and came to the party. And as a result, we were able to set up the trust in 6 days. We were able to get PBO status for it, and we've got the banks deploying money within 3 days of us depositing into accounts. Everyone jumped through hoops. Everyone worked tirelessly, and we worked 16, 18, 20 hours a day with 3 calls a day with the heads of business banking across the 6 banks who had other things to do at the same time. So I think for me, it's the ability to kind of get that creative energy going, but most importantly, to put competition aside when when the significant goal is so important to the country. So yeah, that'd be my kind of takeout.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up there, Bridget?
Sure.
So that happens because of circumstances. I mean, there's an emergency. Is it your sense that just from the nature of the collaborations, that it would be something you expect more of outside of emergency, states of emergency?
It's interesting. And on the breakout earlier session, what I said was, I really think it would be a great pity if we went back to business as usual. I think, unfortunately, the combination, or fortunately rather, the combination of people being locked down in their homes and the crisis made it easier to work together and collaborate. And I hope that the relationships that were built will be maintained. But my caution, I guess, is that it's very easy to get back to normal and to stop making the efforts to keep those relationships warm and strong. And so my plea, I guess, is across sectors, we worked across philanthropy and government and the banking sector and the private sector, is keep those relationships alive and maintain them, because they're going to require effort outside of a crisis situation.
Thanks, Bridget. Khayakazi, what struck you as the insight that you'd like to share about this year?
Well, at Public School Partnerships, our goal and mission is to work in the poorer schools. We exist to improve the quality of education in no-fee public schools. So this puts us in a unique vantage point during the pandemic. We are effectively embedded in schools. So when the pandemic struck, we were right there with SGBs and SMTs, figuring out the next steps. And what I'd say the main insight is that data-driven decisions were critical to every move we made. Lives were on the line because of the lack of information that was available around this new pandemic. And I mean, we had to reach for data across all of the different interventions that we had at hand. We had to learn about the virus. We had to figure out how to access all of our learners. We had to educate and inform parents. And so data was critical. It shaped how we were then able to respond within the schools, at targeted responses, which then also allowed us to monitor the impact of those responses and to adjust accordingly. We fortunately have a group of donors who fund the project, and the data that we've provided allowed us to be more responsive as a result. So information was golden during a time where so much was unknown.
And did you find that people were willing to impart it and share?
Absolutely. I particularly found the response from academia quite encouraging. So, for example, the needs cram studies were instrumental in terms of our response. We needed to know what was happening across, employment levels. It gave us an indication of how to support families, and I mean that's a national study. A lot from the JET educational services interventions and studies that were rolled out. So I was quite encouraged by the level of collaboration, the information that was made readily available across sectors.
Great, thanks. And I suppose that therefore is the next question would be to all of us is how does one use it? Sibongile, you're also then in the broader educational space.
Yes, thanks, Paul. And I share what's been said by Bridget and Kaya. And I think more generally, COVID-19 has, been a disruptor. And it's disrupted the more traditional ways that we do philanthropy and giving. And I think it's been a transformational moment. And so I want to focus more on the personal. And bring it closer to home. So for me, I think it continued to shake my understanding of community, and it enabled me to, extend beyond what my usual and preconceived ideas of what community needs are and who are the communities that need our support. And in a way that it brought closer the struggles that I thought belonged to other communities, so like the Deep Slots and the Alexandras, because suddenly they showed up in my own neighborhood. And because our movement was so limited during lockdown, much of my own individual response had to be more localized, which heightened my awareness of, the surroundings in this neighborhood. It kind of surfaced and brought slap bam to my kind of doorstep the issues that I didn't think affected people that I know. And, I realized that I can now no longer make excuses for why I don't act both locally as well as more kind of further afield in other communities. So it's made philanthropy more real and achievable and less of this enigma and this thing we do when we one day rich as well, and Parker Palmer, who's a great author and speaker, speaks about the importance of being faithful to our perception of the needs of the world and to offer our gifts to those needs. So I think COVID-19 forced us to do that more and more. And of course, I can't divorce that from my own reflections about money. and mostly how it matters most when we use it for a common good, you know, and I just saw how much of it we were able to pull together in such a hurry, you know, which opened my mind to obviously the abundance of money itself, but also just how futile I think hoarding it is, you know, in a world where so many were literally becoming poorer and more destitute. And it gave me a greater respect for the human spirit rather than, you know, for deep pockets when it mattered the most.
So it seems, I mean, from that, it seems almost an irony. So as we were physically taken apart from one another through lockdown and spacing and everything else, and we may have come to a greater appreciation of one another. And so in that sense, I mean, there's potential that comes out of this, isn't there?
Lots of potential. And, you know, Paul, it reminds me of, you know, I got a chance to listen to lots of music, and there was one particular song on loop for me. And I can't believe I'm about to quote a rapper, but, you know, Jay-Z in one of the songs says, you know, here we measure success by how many people are successful next to you. And we say broke if everybody's broke except for you. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of looking at the situation that we were in, you know, outside of these very distinct rich and poor binaries that we used to seeing things in, and really begins to threaten our middle and upper middle class privileges. I know, you know, the UCT Liberty Institute has just released recent numbers, you know, income groups that have shrunk by 50%, you know, the middle and upper middle class and top end in the last year alone. And this might sound a little naive and utopian, but I think this year has softened me somewhat. And I've seen just, how we actually all need each other.
Well, I hope you're right. But Bathylle, you're sitting in a funny perch. I mean, on the one level, you're with the OECD, you've got a global view of things, and you've done a massive research project on the transitions that philanthropy is undergoing globally. You've also done domestic versions of it. But on the other hand, you're right in the middle of it now, with the second wave hitting Europe. So you are, you know, we haven't come to that, and hopefully we won't. But if we do, you're seeing how the next kind of phase of a long emergency works. What's your insight?
What's my anxiety? Well,
no, your insight.
My insight. Yeah, that's better. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me. I think already beyond words, the very fact that you know, we were invited attests to the great collaboration and the partnership we have with IPASA. We're about to release a report on South African philanthropy, and you know, instead of seeing this as competition, because actually it isn't, and it's also very complementary, here we are. So I think this is life proof. It's a very sobering moment, Paul, because we've come to realize how little we know. How we know about a lot of things. And my one lesson to share is that this crisis has unveiled that men and women have been affected very differently. I mean, at first the media was talking about how men were more affected by the virus, and that's, we don't want to dispute that. We just have evidence that women, especially in developing countries, are being affected much more. And this is yet to be reflected in recovery measures that we're seeing from philanthropy to an extent, and especially from governments. Worldwide unemployment is on the rise, and a lot of women were working in the informal sector. As you can imagine, with lockdowns, this is the first thing that goes, and these women are out of any safety nets. They don't have social protection. This is why these community measures, these solidarity measures, you know, what previous panelists have referred to, have been essential. Women account for 70% of the doctors, nurses, and the care economy globally. So it means they're affected, they're in contact with patients, they're caring for the elderly. So that puts them at even more risk. And then finally, domestic violence is on the rise. It's very poorly measured because in a lot of countries, you don't have shelters, call centers developed, or it's you find the incidents completely underreported. And that is something that we wish would translate into policymaking. Why is that important for foundations? It's important because in order to devise good measures, good programs, or to influence policy, first of all, you need an accurate situation, accurate view of the situation. So you need gender disaggregated data in order to be able to address the most vulnerable populations. In some sectors, in some countries, it's going to vary, but you need that, and we do not have that yet. So I'll go back to my initial point. It's very sobering how little we know, and the more we advance, and then that may be on the medical side or on human behavior that sometimes surprises us, sometimes we don't know a lot.
We don't know a lot, but I guess we've learned quite a bit. So let's take this a bit forward, shall we? I mean, on Bathylle, I would imagine that a lot of the lessons you've learned or things you've picked up in the research applies everywhere, and some things will be specific to particular places or regions. If we look forward, and I'm throwing this actually to everybody, if we look forward, we must imagine then that a lot of work that, say, was being done in broader social investment, or particularly in philanthropy, had to, what's the word this year, pivot. So it had to move itself to respond to particular emergencies. And I imagine in South Africa, a lot of that would say less of an emphasis in support given to sort of longer picture things like education, and more to living conditions, such as in health or in food security, things like that. Bathylle, do you think that, and everybody, is that something that's going to affect sort of new focus areas or new emphases in philanthropy in the years ahead?
I think there are two elements that are affecting philanthropy right now. And those are, one, collaboration. It was mentioned, in the beginning by Bridget. So the natural tendency would be to have less of it because resources are scarce. And some funders, some boards will want to focus on their initial, go back a bit like a country will go back to protectionist measures when things are right. You can tend to only talk to, you don't break silos. Silos are even stronger than before. So I think that's clearly a danger. The other one is a danger of trust and transparency. I mean, it's a crisis of trust. You just don't come to, you're afraid of being infected by the others. It's hard to think collectively. This is why I appreciated a lot these remarks on the power of community, because thankfully we also have that. So what does that mean? We need more transparency. Going back to what was said at the beginning of this panel, the danger is that this will increase the level of mistrust. And therefore, as our research, which is about to be published, shows, in South Africa, out of 30 foundations in our survey, only 8 publish their evaluations or the content of their grants. Content meaning just basic information, to whom, what sector. And without this information, how do you expect to collaborate? It's like if I send you, Paul, tomorrow to an area that's underprovisioned, say you have 100 million, go work on domestic violence. You're going to say, well, first tell me who's doing what and where.
Yeah, I've been following this space or working in it for 20 years. The amount of disclosure, and I'm not talking about philanthropy particularly, but also across the corporate sector, which has become a lot more involved, the amount of disclosure has gone down. And it has gone down particularly over the last 10 years. So a lot of people won't describe lists of beneficiaries or type or actual grants, and that does make, we go back to the data issue that Khayakazi brought up. But let's just stick with where there might be new emphases away from things that perhaps we developed quite well. And Khayakazi and Sibongile, you're both in education. Do you see a danger to education there, but at the same time a deepening of other kinds of work? Or do you think we will revert to the types of things that were being supported for a long time? Start with Khayakazi.
Paul, I'm convinced that trade-offs are going to have to be made, particularly at a government level, and then I'd say within NPOs, I feel the constraints of the funding environment are going to force innovation and force organizations to become more efficient in how they deliver support into the education space. And I think it is then imperative for everyone involved in education to ensure that it must remain a focus for government. And this is why I believe the philanthropy has an important role to play in that space, because of the increased pressure on the public purse. And the role is one where, you know, philanthropy is moving forward, innovating and supporting, providing complementary services that support teaching and learning, processes that support teaching and learning. And in addition to that, I'm going to hop on about data because I think it's key. Then provide the systems as well that allow us to then record and get the evidence for that improved outcome and I guess return on investment, which can then close the loop by providing the data that can guide policy and decision making around education at a national level.
Then we know what we're dealing with and what we can do about it. Sibongile, your sense of how education will, I mean, it's an example. Let's rather take it how things might move in terms of emphases from within the philanthropic sphere as you experience it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think it's made it more critical, and I think to up the responses that we've had in education. I mean, I take us as the Learning Trust, and I'm sure everyone will read the piece that we wrote about the after-school sector being a really great equalizer, I think, in terms of social justice, in terms of bringing along people who are disenfranchised. So I think for us, you know, even though we've had to pivot and we've had to do things untraditionally in some ways, and we've had to give money to food relief and all sorts of things, you know, and we had to veer off our usual track, you know, by funding the more immediate needs. I don't think our overall funding priorities will change as the Learning Trust, but as I was saying earlier, in our groups, I do think instead of doing different things, we'll have to just do things very, very differently. And specifically in the world of education, you know, we know that learning deficits will follow us into the future. So, you know, post-COVID, I think we have an even bigger crisis. So we're thinking about, you know, continuing to support learners with materials at home for at-home learning, and that will always be a need. Accelerating, you know, to accelerate this kind of learning recovery that needs to happen is a great need. And funding collaborative work around, you know, taking some of the lessons from COVID and accentuating some of the things that we were doing. If we think about work of organizations like Oliko and Ikamva Youth, which are really known in the after school space, of this transition that we must see from the offline space into the online space. You know, all of us thought it was going to happen so quickly that kids will suddenly learn to work online, but we very quickly knew that, you know, it wasn't going to be possible. And I know our earlier speaker, Abdullah, said, you know, data is so ubiquitous, but, you know, for us maybe, but not, you know, for the rest of these kids that we are working to serve. And so I think it's going to be critical to take some lessons from now and really up the, you know, the ante on some of the work that we've seen make a difference, and some of that work that's going to bridge this kind of offline and online space so that we can warm communities and kids up to using technology. You know, we can't be talking about this digital revolution and the 4IR like they are things that everyone is on board with and everyone understands and everyone can access and has the resources for it. You know, so we're going to have to be a little patient in making those connections from one to the next.
All right, chaps, that's that's how we think things might change, or we suggest they should, or how we can approach them. And of course, data is critical. How we approach each other's work is. We've only got 4 minutes left. I want to ask Bridget, if I could start with you. This is really the issue of, okay, we had to muddle through, anybody in the world, what has been an emergency situation. It has brought with it, or some of the ways we've dealt with it too. I mean, lockdowns and that have brought through real hardship. Should we be preparing for unforeseen emergencies, or even foreseeable ones, second waves, or completely unforeseen ones, in a collaborative way that actually works, or is that actually not practically possible until the thing hits us?
It's an interesting one, because I tend to believe that there's potential to continue to build the relationships that allow collaboration to work when a crisis hits. But I do think that the crisis really creates the environment for that teamwork and that collaboration. And you almost can't create the artificial environment for that to happen without it being real. So that's not to say that we can't take out of this crisis hugely important lessons. And one of the things I want to sort of add to the previous conversation was, what I'm hoping we will be able to take out of this is there are scarcer resources available. And so we need to look at efficiencies in the way in which we spend our money. And that has to be based on evidence. So to Kaya's point, if we can be much more ruthless about funding only those interventions where there is clear evidence that the impact is there, I think that is one of the huge takeouts that will come. And that will mean that when there are plenty of organizations doing very well-meaning and important work, but that aren't necessarily as efficient in others. And I would rather than taking out collaboration, I actually think mergers and kind of a cleaning out of the sector would be a hugely beneficial response to what we're seeing. So collaborating, but taking best of breed and making sure that what we are funding is efficient and evidence-based. And I think what we are seeing a little bit from the government, because there's huge unemployment issues, that they are listening to experts in the sector, in civil society, who are saying, if you want to do skills development, this is the stuff that's working. If you want to do youth development, youth employment, they'll put your money where your mouth is, but don't back a whole bunch of schemes that may or may not work, but really focus on the ones where there's evidence that it does work. So sorry, I didn't quite answer your question, but that's one of the things that I think we want to take forward.
No, I think that's very good insight. So I just want to ask you on that then. So bang for buck, efficiency, that I totally understand. Does this mean to scale? Does this affect then, say, scale of projects? Do you think that would be, so you'd be wanting not just efficiency, but you'd be wanting to know how big the thing is? So fewer things and better.
Yeah, I mean, scale isn't so much, I mean, scale is obviously important because we've got a huge problem and we need to tackle it. But for me, it's about priorities, to say, we need to focus on a few things and get them right, rather than focusing on lots and lots of little things, all of which are important. But go take, to Kaya's point, it's a trade-off, and we have to make hard decisions now to get certain things in place that are deemed to be more important. And I'm pleased I don't have to make those decisions, although I guess as a funder, we choose to fund in certain areas. But it's prioritizing things that are working, and then you can scale and replicate those very quickly. But you can't do everything. And I think we just don't have the resources to be able to do everything. So very hard decisions, trade-offs, prioritization, and then putting effort and resources to where the most likely impact will be achieved.
Right, we're on 16:45. So
can I say something?
I have to ask Sheila for both advice and a contribution. Thank you. Go for it, Sheila.
What we've been talking a lot about is how we do things. But during this period, I've come across a lot of discussion about how does philanthropy strategize in such a fast-moving environment, and can a strategy that applies today still apply next month? And the discussions have focused a lot around the intersection between environment, health, equality, and people are sort of starting to wake up at the big picture. Some of the things we can't predict, but we need to look at in terms of risk. I listened to an input from the head of the Bank of England a couple of months ago, and he talked about 300 million people in India losing their jobs. And I just thought to myself, that means people are going to move. But they're not only going to move because of COVID and the loss of jobs, they're going to move because of global warming as well. And we may be seeing a world that looks very different in the not too distant future. And I think it's quite important for philanthropy to start looking at potential risks way beyond the actual projects and work that we do. And how do we mitigate that? Now, I acknowledge philanthropy doesn't have the same resources as government or even the corporate sector, but it has enormous capacity to lever change, to fund innovation, or to take risk. And I think some of those things we have to seriously look at is how philanthropy does its work in a very different way. I don't think philanthropy, certainly what the organizations I work with, had ever thought they would pump millions into humanitarian causes. It wasn't in their strategies at all, but it shows how quickly they could change. And I think some of the big picture stuff that we have to look at, which starts with the environment and then has this filter right through to everything, to xenophobia, nationalism. You see what's going on in the streets in various countries now. We are in a really fast changing world. And I asked myself that hard question, how do we strategize in that world?
Well, let me bring something in then. So here are three just sort of quick background facts. We know from the Reserve Bank this week that the South African economy will have contracted 7.5% this year. We know from Stats SA's September release that unemployment on the increased definition is at 42%. It's never been that high in over 70 years of tracking it. And we know from last week's release by Stats SA that 47% decrease in household disposable income this year. It's a crisis by any stretch. So that then brings me to the question, so that then has an effect, right, on what available resources there are, whether it's through tax receipts that government can take, or through corporate social investment, etc., for the funding of any kind of developmental work, humanitarian, education, doesn't matter. So it must therefore logically mean that there will be greater pressure upon the philanthropic foundations to pick up the slack, whereas they won't be expecting increased funding themselves, available funding themselves. How do the foundations expect to deal with that? And I throw that particularly to Bridget and to Shelagh and to Bathylle. The pressure is going to be big.
Yeah, if I can, Paul, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of pressure now. I think the way people look at this is that they expect, when they don't know the philanthropic sector very well, philanthropy to be able to do miracles, because they have this idea that everybody, every foundation has the means of Gates, and that it's just free money and they can just it. So while we know that's not true, the picture is not as grim as we initially thought. Our research in South Africa shows that, yes, sources of incomes for foundations are mainly, donations and endowments. And we expect, the economy is not doing well, so corporate foundations will suffer. However, we've seen examples of some foundations which are larger, but still, the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, they've borrowed funding. They've tried to increase or to shift funding over from 2020 to 2021. And I would also say that, going back to what has been said by my fellow panelists, trade-offs and how you spend the money is going to be critical. If I had one piece of advice now to give, would be to refocus on what some could associate with venture philanthropy principles, which is you don't have a lot of partners, you are there with them on financial and non-financial issues to support them instead of spraying and praying. I think it would be one good thing out of this would be more focus on core funding as well, unearmarked funding, because this is really what philanthropy brings to the table as well. Leveraging partnerships in these communities we have, and philanthropists have been very good at developing them. So getting out of the comfort zone and trying to develop them, and then finally change the way you give. So less money is not necessarily a fatality, but I think it has to be spent in a much better and different way.
Thank you, Bridget.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think where philanthropy was moving, both in terms of its endowment investing and also a shift away from pure grant funding, will also kind of create opportunities for using money more effectively. So with impact investing, or with using kind of balance sheets to underpin or crowd in other investors is going to be increasingly important. And I think the idea of focus, obviously, very important, but also finding kind of like-minded partners with whom you can blend your capital. So and what we're looking at and have been looking at Oppenheimer Generations Philanthropies is saying, okay, this is our pot of money, but how can we be most creative about the way in which we use it? And certainly from the South African Futures Trust, because we provided loans to businesses, and we absolutely anticipate, I mean, they were interest-free loans, they're only due to be paid back in 5 years. We anticipate we will get some degree of default in that, and that's completely fine. But what we are going to try and do is encourage as many of those businesses which are now back working and are able to pay back the money, to pay it back so that we can recycle that money straight back into the community. So SMEs then are able to help other SMEs. So I think we've got to think of ways in which we can recycle. I think we've got to think of creative ways in which we can use this limited pool of money, and we can encourage and crowd in government money or GFI money or other types of capital into structures which have clear impact imperatives.
Yeah, so 2 bites of the cherry wherever possible, blended finance, share the risk, and just try and get, again, more bang for buck. Sheila?
Sorry, can you go back to the original question?
I was talking about how philanthropists will deal with the increased pressures that will come there.
Okay.
And we were talking also about more or less that it isn't as bad as it seems. It's also just a question of another pivot.
I don't think philanthropy can fill the gap. I just don't think it's big enough. The area which concerns me most, and unfortunately I don't have the data, is how many wealthy people there are in this world who are so exceedingly wealthy that I can't even imagine how they could ever spend that money in their lifetimes, nor their families in the next 3 lifetimes. And I think when you look at the imbalance of how a few people own so much wealth, that somehow that needs to be redistributed. I don't know how it will be done. Philanthropy is a way to do it. We've had the giving pledge where people have pledged to give away half of their wealth. But I'm not really seeing that a kind of wealth coming through in philanthropy. I don't think philanthropy can fill the gap. But as I said earlier, it can certainly leverage, it can bring people together, it can take risk, it can try out new things. There are lots of ways other than just money that philanthropy can use its power to change things. But in terms of the amount of dollars or rands in the philanthropic pot, it can never replace what we've lost in the last 6 months. And I just think there needs to be pressure on people whose personal wealth is so massive to start thinking about society beyond their own, I suppose, families that live a kind of life that is actually playing a role in wrecking everything. So sorry to put it so bluntly, but that's how I feel.
Can I then talk a bit about philanthropy? Khayakazi, and I just want to throw this out there. I mean, you get philanthropy at different levels, don't you? And a lot of research over recent years in South Africa shows a lot of individual, family-based, community-based philanthropy. So outside of the formal foundations and that sort of phenomenon. And so really, is it your sense, just from the work that you've seen in the partnership this year, that people are getting more involved where they can at whatever level?
Paul, I lost you a little bit at the beginning of your question. And in fact,
I'm really, okay, so let me just get to that. I'm really saying that, you know, philanthropy is at all sorts of levels. It's not necessarily a thing of wealth. It can be a thing of very community, church-based, school-based, and it can be a thing of how people deploy assets they have, whether those are financial or not. And in the work of the partnership, have you had a sense that there's a greater willingness, even in tightened times, for other levels of philanthropy?
Well, we work in very, very impoverished communities as PSP. So it's very difficult to then arrive in that space and, you know, expect that those communities will have resources to provide. I mean, we're there because of that cap. But I've been surprised by the response, particularly during this year with COVID. We've had the challenge of data and devices that all under-resourced communities and schools have faced in terms of access. And I've been surprised by the response of our communities and the level of innovation that they've gone through to identify and find these resources. I mean, cell phone shops, how they've shared devices across families. But just for 1 second, if you'd allow me just to go back to the previous question, I just really wanted to add something to the previous conversation, and wanted to first flag that you really did a great job of highlighting the possible funding gap, and gave a lot of reasons why the focus could possibly shift from things such as education, but really believe that the audience in this conference need to walk away with an understanding that COVID is possibly one of the largest emergencies around education ever in our lifetimes. And the fact that it's estimated that over 9.7 million children will not go back to school. There's an argument for immediate solutions, and that's what the panelists were talking to earlier on around, you know, redistribution of wealth and immediate solutions around funding flows. But there are more long-term strategies around solving problems such as the cost of repetition and the impact that it has on our economy. A study done by DGMT estimates the cost of repetition at about 40 billion per year. And now if we were to direct resources to models that can channel the funding of philanthropy into models that have an impact, that can have more sustained impact on our broader communities, because COVID also had an excellent way of showing us the role that education plays, and more importantly, the social responsibility and the caretaker role that schools present for the broader economy. I just wanted to sort of bring that to the fore, just to further highlight how important it's going to be for our future as a whole, as a country, to continue investing in education, particularly for the reasons raised by Sheila around the innovative nature that philanthropy can explore.
Khayakazi, I can't imagine a better way to end this conversation. What a good one it's been. You know, we've covered a lot, even though it might seem as though we could chat on for hours. We've covered a lot of areas, and they have included, of course, the facts of the different pressures that are on different areas, that we mustn't assume the importance of one immediately without seeing the longer picture, how to be more efficient, to understand that we can box cleverer where we need to. And you know what? There's a little bit of, I think by the end of this year, everybody involved in community development or development generally should use their elbows to pat themselves on the back a little bit. We haven't done too badly, and we've learned a lot, and hopefully then it'll always get a little bit, just that little bit better each year, and that's progress. Well done. Thank you, Khayakazi, Bridget, Sibongile, Bathylle, and Sheila. That's really been good. I'm going to hand straight over to Sarah Rennie to close us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you again, Sheila, for your absolutely outstanding work in editing the annual review for South African philanthropy. And Thank you to the panelists for such a thought-provoking conversation. I hope that those that are listening can really take on board the depth of experience and insight that we have witnessed in this discussion as a taster for the quality of the articles and the thinking that's contained in the annual review. And I really all do encourage you to go onto the IPASA website and to download and browse through the review. And also just to say, in terms of the copyright of the review, everybody is welcome to copy parts of the document for non-profit educational use, on the basis that the author of the article is acknowledged in full. So there is that encouragement to share the knowledge and insight contained in the annual review. So thank you all very much. To the delegates of the symposium, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning for the second session. It starts at 9 o'clock, and it's really going to be a fantastic morning, deep diving into practice and really delving into a lot of the issues that have been already raised here today. So I look forward to seeing many of you there tomorrow morning. Have a lovely evening, and thank you again very much for joining us.